thank you everyone for being here. This is such an important topic. When I think about trauma and I think about poverty, it is definitely a lot of correlation there. And it is important to understand that. When you think about, trauma and when you think about poverty, it can become very abstract and you have so many different versions of it. Trauma, if you look at the DSM, is 7, different kind of listing. When you look at poverty, there's, abstract poverty, situational, and rural poverty, and urban poverty. So it's a lot there. I wanted to bring it more into a picture for you all. Okay. So I'm going to do like a case study. All right. And I want you to picture a single mother of 4 kids. A single mother is addicted to heroin. Okay. It suffers from some mental health issues and concerns. That mother has to work long hours, not by choice, but just to maintain. Okay, make sure food is on the table. Make sure that the kids have somewhat of a, pretty decent life as much as that mother could. Picture the kids having to be raised by or helped with the grandmother and neighbor helping, that mother out. Picture that mother also having the kid's father too, and losing both of them. One through, unfortunately, drinking and wind up falling, hitting his head and going into a coma, dying a couple of days later. Leaving this single mother with no support. Imagine Social Security benefits being so low, less than $100. Imagine the other child's father not being there because of substance use and just absence. Imagine that same mother living in Brooklyn, New York, and the crack epidemic hitting the complex, the projects. Imagine that same mother trying to figure out, how am I going to get my kids out of here? On top of, don't forget, that mother struggling with her own stuff. And the mother worried that her 3 boys would either, 1, be shot and killed, or on drugs, or paralyzed. Imagine that same mother having the fear that her daughter would wind up a prostitute or anything else, because that's kind of the product of the environment, right? Imagine, the family having to get, Christmas holidays, it always was donations and signing up so that the kids could have something, and that mother being very resourceful and trying to make sure, that parent, that the kids had something. Imagine a child that's a part of that family, and you see that child. The child does not have any sexual abuse and no physical abuse, some emotional abuse with yelling and screaming in the home. Imagine that child getting free lunch in school because they qualified for free lunch, but the free lunch, the food was not enough. And so that child going around asking friends, can I have some potato chips? Can you have $1? Imagine that same child experiencing one day of being ripped out of their family's care because the mother had a mental breakdown and threatened to kill up the whole kids, and CPS, which did their job, coming in to make sure the kids are safe and okay, and that one child was left behind when the brothers was able to get away, was older, and no, that child could not stay with the grandmother or the neighbor, but had to go to a stranger's home. Imagine the effect of that on that child, the effect being intense fear when the child came back home. Remember, it was one day, but that child has a long-term effect of intense fear whenever that child always has to check the door. That child, despite knowing that the door is locked, will consistently check the door over and over again with intense fear that somebody would take that child, even though that child is an adult. Imagine the nightmares that child experienced growing up and not knowing Imagine even as an adult, sometimes that child as an adult has some nightmares, not as much as when that child was younger. Imagine that child being afraid to communicate that with anyone, because if that child does, it runs the risk of somebody coming into the home and seeing what's going on and taking that child out of the home again. Imagine that child having a learning disability and not being able to identify what it really is. Imagine that child being placed in school and having to go around the classroom and read, and that child either skipping up 5, counting the seats and saying, okay, that child would be the 5th person reading and going up to that 5th sentence to read it over and over again. Imagine that child, when it's that child's turn, reading really fast so that the next person could go, or that child disrupting the class, rather that is, throwing something or yelling at the teacher so that the teacher can have that child leave. Imagine that child, if that doesn't work, imagine that child says, oh, I got to go into the bathroom and go to the bathroom. Imagine that child secretly in the bathroom start crying, saying what's wrong, what's going on, and praying that something tragic would happen to somehow shake up the brain to be normal, because there's no words around what was going on. Imagine that child, when you see that child, you see their presentation is sometimes anger, sometimes shut down, feelings of helplessness and low self-esteem, intense shame, placed in special education, not knowing how things is going to get better. Imagine that child having an adverse childhood experience of 6, trying to figure out what's going on. Imagine the outer appearance that child presents with very athletic and happy and smiling. So not everybody gets to see that other side and gets kind of overlooked of what's really going on. Imagine that child growing up to be actually a teen parent on Section 8 and receiving Medicaid and benefits. And you see that cycle starting to happen for that child. Imagine that child dealing with a lot of microaggressions at organizations and actually getting paid $5,000 less than their white coworker who they actually trained. Imagine that woman at that time experiencing all of that. What do you all think about the fate of that person? What's the outcome? What do people say about this case study that I just shared? You can talk. What's the outcome? Some people would say that this child would, because of the adverse effects, would have a short life expectancy, would also have a lot of medical issues, right? What else? What else would people?
Challenges raising that child.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. Challenges.
And breaking free of that poverty.
Right.
Right. Absolutely.
Definitely a lot of, I guess trauma is the word, but stress, frankly, it sounds like, that child is employed and perhaps has a great future, but either way, there's still a lot of stress and difficulty that they're carrying with them, no matter what the journey is.
Right. Imagine yes.
I know you can.
Oh, no, go ahead. Yeah.
Difficulties and challenges raising their own children.
Right, absolutely. And that intense fear of that repeating the pattern, and being that the statistics, I think about even that parent, and no wraparound services for that parent, either, and how that parent is feeling. I think about the fact that even that parent, when we look at poverty and we look at mental health and how it connects, right? We see that even the mother who had to work long hours just to feed, to keep food on the table, couldn't go to long-term substance use treatment, even though deeply desired to, or even mental health services, because guess what? Mental health services closes at 5, sometimes 7 o'clock, and then on the weekends it stops, as if mental health and addiction stops on the weekends. Okay. So where's that support at? Right? When we talk about even that case study and we talk about just food, When we look even within our county, where's Wegmans at? They're out of the city. They're East Avenue. But East Avenue is not Thurston. It's not Arnett. Not Hudson Avenue. It's not Flint Street. You see what I'm saying? When we look at our treatment programs, where's our treatment programs at? Downtown Rochester, on the outskirts of the city. We have Lake Avenue, we have Baden Street, Joseph Avenue, but the bulk of our treatment programs are not. So again, you see the connection between the poverty in that story, in that case study, right? And you also see the trauma and experience that so many people have experienced. What I will say, and be completely honest and transparent, is that story is my story. And the only reason why I'm sitting here today is because the people in my community wrapped their arms around me. And I did have some really good teachers, especially one in particular, who wrapped herself around me and made sure that they became the voice for me when I was voiceless. But I'm an exception. And I think what United Way is really, RMAPI is really trying to do is say, how do we collectively work together? And how do we work together on not only in our own individual community, but how do we work together in our own power to influence our environments and change up some of the policies and rules that agencies and organizations have, because some of those rules and policies are not state mandated. They're more of a policy and procedure for that organization. How do we help these organizations come out of their comfort zone to have the action? And so when I talk about, poverty and trauma, it's important, and in particular, I'm talking about the urban, trauma. We have to look at limited access to health and education. The documents that I gave you will highlight that. When you talk about racism, talk about that being a public health issue. When someone is experiencing trauma, okay, in particular, trauma period, but I'm going to specifically talk a little bit more about racialized trauma, okay? So every day being black and being afraid. Every day not knowing who's going to follow you, not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing, or when that officer is behind you, officer may be completely fine and may not even be looking at you, but you get that intense fear right in your throat. You take a deep breath and you start praying, oh my God, you start shaking. And you say, oh my goodness, they're running my place, oh my goodness. If you have anybody in your car, you say, get your camera ready, turn on the camera. If they pull me over, make sure you press live. And it's intense fear. What that intense fear does, it actually creates toxic stress, which actually increases the cortisol level in the brain. Now, trauma does that as well. But when we talk about racialized trauma, it goes a little bit more deeper. Because now I have to fear going grocery shopping. Okay? Healthy cortisol level, it actually helps to regulate distress and notify you of danger, so that fight or flight. So it's important to have the cortisone in your system. It's good for regulating your blood sugar level as well as high blood pressure. So it's actually really good. It helps with energy. It actually helps with memory within the brain. So it's great. But remember what I said, when you have that intense fear, you have that hypervigilance and you're always on. Always, always, always on. That is when it becomes too much within your system. And actually what it does is it affects your memory. To name some stuff, it also impacts the way people sleep. They're sleeping, their eating habits. It actually it impacts mood. So the question would be, are we diagnosing our people with the appropriate diagnosis, or looking at the cortisol level and the trauma and how does all of that work together, right? It actually, having a high level of cortisone can actually damage the brain and actually really, reshape the brain as well. So it's that hypervigilant and always being on. And you look at your kids, you look at the kids in the community, you say, why do they act like that? There's multiple reasons why. Does that make sense? So again, when I talk about the trauma and when I talk about, trauma as well as poverty, it really goes hand in hand. But I have to also say that if somebody experiences poverty, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be experiencing mental health. And vice versa. If you experience mental health, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be in poverty. But if you are experiencing poverty, you're going to be exposed to quite a bit of stuff within your own environment that then affects your emotions. And so if we help people and we say, yep, we're going to help with your mental health, but they go back home into their environment where it's boarded up in the community, boarded up houses, how does that affect your mood, your desire, your energy to live, right? If you can't afford to get your children something, or you have to choose treatment or taking the money to get to treatment for transportation. Do you see what I'm saying? So it goes hand in hand, and we have to think, we have to do a lot more of how do we, each one of us, how do we work together to make some true impact and not just talk about it. Does that make sense? I had a lot of other stuff, but do you have any questions or, thoughts? You'll see the handouts I gave you talks about ACE. I had some data here, but I just really wanted you all to get a picture and a face of trauma and poverty and the effects of it, and how do we start really calling to action and doing our part. Questions, thoughts? I don't know if I ran out of time. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
5 minutes, thank you. Oh, perfect.
So, trauma in general and the effects of trauma have been one of the root causes that RMAPI identified, really in its founding. Maybe it was 5 years ago when that kind of study came out. And since then, we've supported several nonprofit organizations to get trained in kind of trauma response approaches to their work. There's a level of awareness there. And so given that, I wonder, and I don't know how deeply you're immersed in what is or isn't going on with respect to RMAPI, but I wonder what, is that it, train nonprofits in trauma response, or is there more, what does, taking into and applying what we're learning today, like what might it look like, maybe beyond what's already happening?
Yeah, and I think that's where, RMAPI is going into the direction of saying, how do we develop those matrix for it, right? And a lot of organizations were saying, we're going to do trauma-informed, right? But a lot of those organizations that's practicing trauma-informed are traumatizing their staff. You see what I'm saying? So how do we start to incorporate various practices that are outside of the non-traditional practices? You know what I'm saying? How do we look at trauma-informed through the lens of cultural competency as well? So that's important, and I spoke earlier and said, when you look at post-traumatic slave syndrome, that book, it gives you a lot of information, right, that some programs are not even incorporating. When you talk about, and I'll talk specifically for the Black population, relationships is very important. Relationships. How do we start incorporating those practices? How do we start becoming more consistent with our youth? You know what I'm saying? when we talk about trauma informed, have we talked to the youth about why they're having nightmares? Or all of a sudden they're starting to wet the bed. It's not that you're crazy. You see what I'm saying? So how do we start to educate the community that's not getting this information? And I think, again, we all have a unique part in the roles that we play within our place of employment, as well as within our ability, and I'll say it, our ability to vote and hold people accountable, as well as hold ourselves accountable. So I know that was a lot, but it's not just one answer to all of this, it's multiple. And poverty is not just about money and the lack of food. It is not just about trauma. You know what I'm saying? It is about multiple factors. Make sense?
How do we get more into prevention, I guess,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
the question. I was recently struck by how trauma around gun violence is not equally distributed. There are pre-pandemic, there are 9 million children who live in census tracts where there have been people either killed or deeply wounded by gun violence. That has a huge spillover effect on those kids
Right.
for the rest of their lives. But,
Absolutely.
so I'm just curious,
Yeah.
as the Office of Mental Health in Monroe County, like what are some prevention devices that you think aren't being, like RMAPI could champion, or things that we could do?
So I think when we talk about the Office of Mental Health, it really focuses on that behavioral health component with prevention. And there's prevention going into schools, there's preventions with, clinics trying to go out and talk about mental health and addiction and effects of it, right? That's also one part of it. I think we have to, again, collectively come together and figure out how are we going to do the prevention collectively. I would love to see how organizations and jobs will start to actually incorporate prevention within their staff. You know what I'm saying? Educating their staff. You have a lot of employees that may be, what we call frontliners or entry-level staff. How about educating them on some of this stuff? Investing more, organizations investing more into the community. When we look at behavioral health services, a lot of the investments is in, again, that mental health and addiction within clinics. You know what I'm saying? Within, we have some of it, we have people, outreach workers going around trying to educate people on what trauma is, right? So I think it's, I don't know if I answered your question, but I think as a collective is not just a one area, which is the Office of Mental Health. I would also say that we consistently are advocating on a state level of how do we get clinics to go into these impoverished areas? How do we encourage clinics to open up later? How do we encourage them to, and we're happy that telehealth is, hopefully here to stay as well, to help out. But again, remember what I said, you can help somebody with their mental health or with their addiction, but if their living environment does not change, if they go to that job and they're continuing to experience the oppression, do you see what I'm saying? That's only one part of the puzzle. So again, I think with what Aycock was saying is that having more of these kind of meetings to say, how do we have that call of action? And I think she started doing that with the call for people to do $15 an hour? You know what I'm saying? And organizations jumping on a bandwagon with that. But then the next question is, when you help somebody to become financially, right, and they have a job and their income, how do you help them with financial literacy so that that stays that way? Because the cost of living has increased. Did that $15 help? Does that make sense? So again, it's collectively. Okay, I wrap up. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.